stream here. So you will get a new link momentarily in the chat on the current YouTube stream, and we'll go from there. We go. Technology is fun but hard. See here, so we'll wait for people to join up here, and then we'll start in a second. I should get some elevator music set up for occasions like this. Oh, nice. Best gift I could get at this point.
Elevator music is my middle name. I guess it's technically two.
I gotta have you on every time now. I mean. Okay. So I guess we'll wait a few more seconds here for people to join up, but otherwise we'll get started. And I think most people should be on the new stream now. Let me just close down the old stream here. There we go. Excellent. So, yeah. Maybe some more elevator music? No? Roll on? Yeah? All right. Slightly more upbeat. Okay. So let's get started. I think most people have joined now from the old stream. Sorry about that initial glitch. Welcome everyone. This is the first meetup ever of the new kind of online relay meetup that we're hosting. My name is Gabriel, and I'm from Sweden. I work at a consultancy in Stockholm called Artsy. And today we have two pretty, I'd say in the relay space, very famous people with us as guests. We have Eloy Duran, who's been at Artsy before, and Artsy has been a long time user of Relay. And John Cousins, who's, well, I guess most people know John, but from the Facebook core team, Relay. Do you want to say a few words about yourself? Maybe Eloy can start. Just introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm Eloy Duran. I hail from Amsterdam, the Netherlands. You can't see it right now because it's dark, but we're on the water. I worked at Artsy for 5 years, where indeed we started using Relay, I guess in 2016. And now I'm at Microsoft working on React Native related stuff in Office.
Mm.
Yeah, what's up? I'm Jan. I work on Relay for a long time now. I think I just looked it up. It was over 5 years now. Starting with Relay Classic, so like there was lots of iteration and like kind of evolving going on, and yeah, really enjoy working on the kind of frameworks to make front-end development easier, or trying to make it easier. Working alongside the React folks and React Native folks, and yeah, trying to make data fetching a little bit easier. Before I was working on kind of different interfaces at Facebook, and kind of saw how revolutionary React was, and like removing a lot of the like our custom model view controller framework that we had was like such a mess, and React Native React just made this part of the like kind of the front end part to connect data to rendering like just so much more clear. And like I'm hoping to bring a little bit of the simplicity and of declarative data fetching to data fetching instead of only to rendering.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. But I personally think you've done a great job. So, so working really well. So this is the meetup's going to be streamed on YouTube, as you've seen. There's good to know that there's a delay. We're on Zoom here, me, John, and Aloy, and there's a delay of about 20 to 30 seconds. So if there's questions in the YouTube chat and we're not answering them momentarily, it's not to be rude. It's because there's a delay. So I'll try and keep track of the chat as much as I can as well. So if you have questions, feel free to ask him, and we'll try and follow up with them as much as possible. And also, after the meetup is done, there's going to be a kind of a post-meetup Discord hang, both if you want to just regular text chatting, but also voice chatting and even video if you want to. It's going to be available. And that's going to be at a separate Discord server that I've set up. And I'm going to post a link for that at the end of the meetup. And also, there's going to be like quite a lot of links in my slides. I'm going to post all of them in the chat as well, so everyone can, don't have to type off the screen, which isn't the greatest experience. And finally, just before we get started, if you want to present something on this meetup or participate in any way, please just reach out to me at Relay Meetup on Twitter. I'd love to have just about anything. Like it doesn't have to be a presentation. It could be just live coding or showing something off that you've done, or just an aspect of Relay that's interesting to you. So high and low, just reach out and we'll talk about it. Yes. So the agenda for today is I'm going to start off by doing a kind of news segment. And I'm going to try and do this every meetup where I just gather up like news and things that has happened in the Relay community. And then after that, we're going to talk to Aloy about how the experience of using Relay at Artsy has been throughout the years. After that, we're going to have a short break, and then we're going to talk about updating the cache after mutations, which is kind of a big topic. And to help us, we have both Aloy and John. And I'm going to start there by just briefly going through what the problem space is and whatnot. And then we'll try and discuss how Facebook and Artsy has approached these problems throughout the years and what type of strategies there are and whatnot. And yeah, again, after the meetup, if you have time over or want to chat or anything, feel free to join the Discord. At least me is going to be there, so at least one person. And yes, so some news from the Relay community. There's a few cool things going on. So some basic TypeScript emission recently landed in the Rust Relay compiler, and that was championed by Martin Sta. I'm going to butcher a lot of GitHub nicknames here today, so I'm very sorry when I do that. But from what I understand, a basic version of TypeScript emission has landed, which is incredibly cool. And the turnaround on that was pretty spectacular. It took way less time than I anticipated anyone spending on it, which was really cool. So Martin Starr is the real deal, which is very cool. And then another nickname to butcher here, Mariser has been championing upgrading the Relay types, the TypeScript types, which has been really nice as well, because I believe he has extended the coverage of the types quite a lot and worked on the new concepts in the experimental APIs as well, which is really cool. And then a thing that I'm personally very excited about is that there's an effort going on in the open source part of Relay to support entry points using Webpack, basically. And entry points, for those who don't know, is a new concept that isn't documented yet, but it's about, and John, please correct me here if I'm wrong, but it's about loading both data and code at the same time in a sensible way that works with concurrent mode and suspense. Is that in the ballpark?
Basically, what we're dealing with at Facebook, the whole new Facebook.com, maybe you've seen the new page. the new design, is like all written in Relay and React, and we obviously like have pretty high goals and like requirements for performance. So for us, it doesn't work that you navigate from page A to page B, that we first download all the JavaScript for the new page. Then that new JavaScript knows like, oh, I need to fetch this data, and then has a second round trip to fetch the data, and then potentially another round trip to fetch like images or anything. So like our goal really is that we can click a link, and any link that can be many like follow-up pages from any page you're on, and like to minimize the number of round trips you can get, so that the server can instantly respond with all of the requirements. And we can do things like on hover preload some of the data. If you like hover a link long enough, maybe we can start fetching the data for the next page before you even click. And yeah, so that's what entry points are about, and they're basically interesting to like larger single page applications where you don't want to include all routes on the homepage.
That's interesting. So as we're on the subject, did like reaching that API and that type of solution take a lot of iteration, and like how was that process for you? Since it's quite, like you mentioned, there's a pretty specific set of demands for Facebook.com as compared to maybe other apps.
Yeah, there was definitely like lots of different questions that we had to answer. Another one is data-driven dependencies, and basically it's like we started thinking of like, what does it mean to write Facebook.com using Relay and React, like render everything on React. On another super interesting case is newsfeed, where you have many different types of stories, right? Most of them we call it like separate unit stories. A tweet, on Twitter would be tweets, and they can be of many different types. There's like a text or a photo, but there's also video, election reminder, go vote. There's like birthday units and like anniversaries. I don't know what else, right? Like hundreds of different types. So we like also don't want to like fetch those renderers, all the like React code for all of those components. And like we had to come up with data-driven dependencies for that. I don't think it's like well documented outside. It kind of needs like deep integration with our bundling strategy, our kind of server side. So we haven't like been able to like fully document this for open source usage. But yeah, I'm pretty excited about the Webpack project for entry points. Entry points, I think, is the first step towards this, right? Like you can imagine allowing different routes to be separated, but for us, it's like even within one route, there can be like so many potential like variations that we want to be able to like also those include the code for them and the data for them, but only if you have a birthday story, we want to like load the code and the data for the birthday story right now. But yeah, I think like basically over time we were like, we need to be able to like not first download the JavaScript code and then download the data. We need to like really be able to do like download both at once, and kind of like arrive from there. We arrived at like defining the routes together with the data requirements, the queries, or an entry point is like bundling a component together with parameters and the component and the queries to fetch.
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine that entry points is going to be useful to most people, and then data-driven dependencies are probably going to be useful to less people than the entry points itself.
Yeah, but these were like kind of the issues that we were facing when we're like, how do we make this happen, right? Like we cannot
Yeah.
have like megabytes of JavaScript code. I think we're like still pretty bad in terms of like how much code we download, but you know, it could be a lot worse.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what the current numbers are. Those are just so different depending on like what configurations you load and like what kind of experiments you're in. But
yeah, I think we're a lot of people that are like salivating when we're thinking about what setup you must have with your routing and your server-side rendering and everything around that.
yeah.
I want to add that there's really great videos of presentations from, I guess it's F8, about building I don't know what they're called, building Facebook with the Relay or something like that go into these. And
building the new Facebook or something. Yeah, actually, Watkins did a great talk on that. Yeah, on the 3D topic, data-driven dependencies topic. I think there's a talk from Joe from ReactConf 2018, 2019.
Yeah, no, I'll make sure to link to those as well, just so people have a chance to watch them, because if you haven't, they are really good, and they're also like what I found so good about them is that they really explain why you need these things and why it makes sense to, like, of course it makes sense to start fetching data before you're fetching code, rather than fetching code and then triggering the fetch of the data, when you kind of can do that in a fairly sensible and easy way with the right integrations. So I think that's very good. I'll make sure to link to that. Also, I just want to mention briefly that this is championed by Edwin and Mariser again. And there's a issue that you can go in and read about kind of the roadmap and also some early documentation on entry points, which I found very interesting. Yeah, but again, I'll post all of the links here so you don't have to type off the screen. And then also I want to mention that there's new versions of React Relay offline with friends. And I think the new version is supporting render as a patch pattern, which we discussed here. And really, like, check out everything that Morris, the GitHub nickname, does. He does so many cool things around Relay and here, like he's made Relay for Angular, for instance, and also he did the first unofficial kind of hooks package for Relay, which a lot of people have been using, which supports hooks without suspense and concurrent mode. Which was also really nice. So check out everything he does. It's really good. And that's it for the news segment. But if you have other things you'd like to share about what's going on currently, please feel free to post them in the YouTube chat, for instance. And we'll find a good place to kind of bring them up during the meetup if we can. Now, Eloy, let's talk. So I guess people who've been in the Relay community for a while probably recognize Artsy and also probably recognize Eloy. But Artsy has been an integral part of the community since, well, forever, I guess, since the inception of Relay, more or less. And so we're going to talk to Eloy, and we're going to talk to Eloy about the experience around using Relay as a company for a long time. So without further ado, Eloy, would you mind like telling us a bit about your background and what led you to both Artsy and then Relay, I guess?
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to thank you, Gabriel, for starting this meetup. It's really great that we finally have something like this. And I guess now is as good a time as any to do something globally, rather than just in Stockholm, which I'm sure is a very cool place to have a meetup. But
I have to fly you all in. I mean,
okay. Well, scratch that. We'll do it again next year. Yeah. So let's see. So I'm Eloy. I have always been in Amsterdam, born and raised, and have done all my work from here. And a lot of my work, actually, I started doing software development because of open source software. I did open source without realizing what it was, and that's how I learned to do software development. And so it was all very natural for me to keep doing it that way and work with people globally. At some point, I made some software that is used a lot because I was in the native iOS space at the time. That's called CocoaPods, dependency manager, and that led me to meeting, amongst other people, Orta, the Rocks, who was already at Artsy at that time. And after working with him on that project for a while, might have been 2 years, we connected the dots and figured I should start working for Artsy remotely. And so that was in 2015 that I started there. I started on the mobile team, which at the time there was a separate mobile team of a few people. And then there was a separate web team, and web was basically all the other stuff. And fast forward a year into that adventure, a year-ish, I would say, we realized that we always kept chasing the web team in terms of parity, but we were never able to really be proactive and go off and build features that we wanted to build, because we were always trying to catch up with the web team, and they were so fast to deploy, right? Whereas iOS apps, who knows how long it takes. And also realizing, as we brought in new people, that the application, partly due to the native requirements, but also due to being an application that at the time already existed for a few years, had built up, a large footprint, let's put it that way. And it was not that easy to onboard people. So we had a situation where we would never have a humongous team. We had aspirations to also to build out new features, to at some point maybe also build an Android app. And so it became logical for us that we wanted to include developers from the rest of the engineering team. At that time, React had already taken off on the web, and some of our web engineers had already started experimenting with it. And I don't recall, I guess it was a year earlier that React Native saw the light first publicly. And so we chose a few, we saw a few options. And one of them was we would create our own stuff inspired perhaps by React, maybe use Component Kit, which is like a native version of React that Facebook also releases publicly. But then through these explorations, we found Relay and GraphQL, and already got enamored by that a little bit, and figured, well, then we would have to build a Relay as well. And while it all sounds very exciting, reality is, of course, that maybe we don't want to be maintaining something like that, being such a small team. And also, it would still require all the other engineers to dive into the native code. Obviously, there was Swift as well, and we had some experience with that. But we decided Swift, while it has great purposes, it's just a language. It doesn't bring in a new paradigm. Doesn't necessarily leverage the ability of the JavaScript developers that we had. So we were fortunate enough to know people through our open source interactions already at Facebook that were using already in production React Native and Relay. And we met with them, and we asked them about, how is it to use it in reality, not just the few blog posts that existed that were like, wow, this is amazing, right? Because not all things are always amazing. So you want to know. Well, look, we are definitely adventurous people, but that there's going to be downsides that you have to deal with, right? And our philosophy has always been that we have to be able to maintain any dependency that we take on. Once we add it to our application, it's not we cannot treat it as a black box. It's part of the application, right? So you need to know what you take on and need to feel comfortable doing so. So we did exploration with that. The meeting was good. That was definitely great food at Facebook, so maybe that influenced it a little bit. We had did an exploration. I think a month. We ported like the artist view, which is an important view within the Artsy application. I'll cover quickly what Artsy is in a second, but it is not the most important one, at least not at the time. And so it was a good way to see how that went. And yeah, look, I think React is great. The paradigm, the way of building UI. I think that it's JavaScript. Well, we didn't start using React, etc., because of JavaScript. That's, but it was definitely a good way to onboard people that already knew JavaScript. The one part was that we, being native developers and also knowing that we cannot deploy that often, we did not want vanilla JavaScript. So initially we tried to use Flow as well, because obviously it already existed. But I think in our experience at the time, at least, Flow felt like we needed to keep working on it, to keep it working for us. And the other thing we tried, TypeScript at the time, kind of just worked well with the IDE as well. So, suggesting a solution to our engineers that already knew something, especially the native ones initially, where you have an IDE and things work. That was definitely the way we decided to go. TypeScript, I assume we'll definitely get into, because that was always an issue. But yeah, so let's see. So that is the journey of how we arrived at using Relay at Artsy. So quickly about Artsy itself. Artsy is an application. Artsy is a platform that makes all of the world's aspires to bring all of the world's visual art online. It used to be in your pocket, but I guess it's not just mobile apps anymore.
Yeah.
And so we do that by providing or I guess I should say we did that, because Artsy still does it. I'm no longer at Artsy. By providing avenues for galleries to provide their corpus of art on our platform and have it suggested as we build up a profile of what people like. The same applies to art from institutions and later on auctions. I think the application itself, both the iOS application and later on the web application, are in many ways just dumb viewers of a bunch of JSON. We do not do a lot of mutations. We do not have a lot of interesting state. Like, look, for like the auction side of things has a lot of interesting state, but that was built entirely, well, almost entirely from scratch at the time. We definitely did not. I don't know if Relay would have been able to at the time require the flexibility that we would have needed. And this was the Relay Classic days. So I think we definitely have a lot of experience in how you would want to render pages, view pages, how you want to build them up. I think at some points probably these views don't technically need runtime abilities that React or Relay offer. So sometimes the trade-off, of course, is you spend a little bit of, you pay a little bit of runtime cost in this case for the ability of having these engineers being productive in a single environment that they know, right? So with React being learn once and write everywhere, which I would say at Artsy definitely paid off. When I left Artsy, I was in, we had monthly demo days where we would show products, pieces that were built. And there I would be surprised about, like, we built this piece of the iOS app and I didn't even know. That was good times. Yeah, so that's Artsy. You should definitely check it out. It still exists and goes well. And the nice thing about them, and I guess because of our philosophy, is that all of the client applications are publicly available. They are open source. They are on GitHub, and it has made it incredibly. Like, I always giggle a little bit when in Relay context we talk about, is there documentation for this? Well, most likely not, but at least there's a lot of source. right?
Yeah.
And so it's great to be able to provide a resource that is like an actual working application that people can view. And I guess that also helped a little bit with trying to build up some sort of community initially around Relay. I don't know how far you want to go into that now, or just.
I think like I'm definitely gonna another thing I'm gonna post in the chat, but links to all of the reposts, because that is pretty spectacular. That and it's also something that has existed for quite a long time and been iterated on, and it's an open source real product, which is pretty cool. And I also agree with it's usually that with Relay, like there's no documentation and it's hard to understand. It's just that I think we're just bad at linking stuff. I think that's the biggest problem. There's quite a lot of things actually if you dig deep, especially around Artsy. So, but I think that's good too. It's very good to cover what type of application Artsy is, because when you talk about Relay, usually, at least that's my experience, people tend to think that it's only for very complex applications with lots of state and whatnot. And I personally think the principles is for everything, more or less. And it's the principles that I find attractive with Relay. So that's
Yeah, I think one important thing about Relay, how in the data fetching works, is really it's very similar to what React brings to UI development. It's the componentization, right? You can, with React, at least with most apps, if you don't use like too much context or other magic that's like kind of global. Typically with a React app, you can open a single component and kind of make sense of it. What it does, make changes to it, like change the layout of a component or like what it displays. And it can kind of reason locally about like one or two components or something. And I think that's super important for teams of more than one person, basically, right?
Yeah.
It's great when you have a new engineer come in and they can look at, you say like fix this bug or add this feature, and they open like up 2 or 3 files and like probably can make sense of like at least smaller scale changes to the app. I think Relay brings that with the data dependencies, where a component defines its fragment of exactly the data it needs and it wants to reason about, and you can no longer need some data, you can remove it from that component, and if there's nothing else fetching that component anymore, it's no longer fetched from the server, but like if you need an extra field, you just define it in your component, and you kind of have locally only available, and it kind of encapsulates locally what you can do and what you need and what you don't need. And I think that really is important, right? Otherwise, I think like everybody has probably been in the situation where like you no longer need to display the like full name. It's like, okay, I no longer need the full name. It's like, can I remove that from like my data fetching theory somewhere else? It's like, I guess you can like grab over your code base to see if like you've displayed full name somewhere and maybe not, and then remove it. But I think that's a big selling point for Relay, that you can locally open up a file and change things around and drop into a different place of the code base and kind of make sense of it in that way.
Safety of it. So Eloy, as you're coming from the native side, how was your initial thoughts when you started with, I guess both React and JavaScript, but also especially then Relay? It's quite different, I guess. I'm not from the native side, so I wouldn't know it.
Yeah, well, I maybe that might have made it a little easier for me to overcome some of the initial hurdles that people often mention when it's about Relay, right? Yeah, there's a compilation step. That, our app just took like minutes to compile. So
your app is not Xcode, at least.
yeah. So So there's that, and and I understood why there was compilation and and things like emitting types, just was just such a clear win for me, that I couldn't really imagine it doing it a different route. Now, I think for me that was all very logical, why to choose such dependencies. But I have to recognize that I was maybe not, I didn't fully realize at the time what a burden that could be on some of my peers that do not come from that background. And so, initially there wasn't another client. But the interesting thing is that some of the things people would say later on, they definitely also said at the time, but there was no existing alternative, at least, right?
Yeah.
Later on, at some point when there were alternatives, it was like, well, this seems to work so much more like just JavaScript, where you just, you fetch something like at the root of your tree or whatever the tree might be, and you have a blob of data, and then you take it apart and you start shoving it down the tree. And that seems so logical. But I think also I don't want to say all of the people because I just empirically can't even remember, but I would say many people that I spoke afterwards, once they fully understand how things like data masking work, data masking, I guess, conceptually at the compile time with types and at runtime, and how they should be debugging things, is people really like that. And it just, it enforces, like, sometimes it's good to have constraints to be able to focus on the parts that you actually want to focus on, right? If sometimes maybe something seems like at times like I should be able to make this little workaround because it just makes sense, or it's just a better way of doing it at that time, right? Having that constraint makes you at least not do it at that time, and then probably you thank yourself, others, or in my case yourself, a few weeks later on when you come back to it and like, what is this? And so I definitely, I agree, like with what Jan was saying, right? I think there was I had two perspectives at it at some point. I fully understand and agree with the componentization and some enforcement of it, but I also see that it is like there is this initial hurdle where they first need to understand what it is before they appreciate it, and it takes a little while before you get up that mountain.
Bitten a few times before that.
Yeah. So I think that was interesting, right? Because for me it was so logical, like coming from that background, like you have compilation, you have some enforcement, and it all makes sense. And then not fully realizing how other people had been developing JavaScript applications. So I think in the end it definitely paid off, but it is it's something to be cognizant of, and obviously something that we still hear in the Relay channel, right, all the time.
Yeah, I mean, my view is not always, but for a long time, been that Relay is like a grumpy senior developer that's mentoring you. Like, it's really hard to get PRs through. And you're always going to get like backing on. You should do this other way, and isn't that a hack? Like, you shouldn't do it that way. And it's going to suck, but you're going to fix it, and you're not going to have that problem again later on. And that has always been like the big thing for me with Relay, that it kind of, well, I would say gently, but it's not always that gently, but it pushes you in the right direction, kind of. So you end up doing the right thing, which is, it's not nice at first, but then it's very nice when you get deeper into it, kind of.
Yeah, absolutely.
So since you've used Relay for such a long time, like onboarding people into Relay, then we brushed on it now, obviously, with the compilation step and whatnot, but how has that been over time for you at Artsy? I guess new developers has come and gone for a long time. So
initially it was easy enough, like, because the native developers needed to move to the stack, and for them there was just so much new stuff where the JavaScript and whatnot was new, and the environment that they would work in. The compilation step of Relay was not something that anybody complained about. Like I said, right? Yeah. We dealt with compiling. Moving to onboarding the web engineers was definitely an entirely different experience. And yeah, I mean, so look, first of all, engineers like to, I guess maybe it's at Artsy, but definitely in general, there's a lot of engineers that like to figure things out themselves, right? They don't just want to, like, on day one, be like, tell me everything. And so there not being good documentation targeted specifically at that step is definitely does not make it easier. I myself, I'm not a great documentation writer. We definitely had some people on the team that came to Relay a little bit later on, and they started writing good documentation, and they're great at educating. And so I think at some point when we realized that not only is this the direction for the mobile application, but also perhaps for the web application, and standardizing that, we decided, okay, so we should just have a week of, what did we call it? The week of JavaScriptures, which was just like every day we would tackle a topic, a piece of the stack. And so one day was, like JavaScript itself, and then the next day was React, and then the next day was TypeScript with React probably, and then at some point came Relay, which was probably good, but it's still I always kept having to take people, like, a little bit of white glove entry, like an hour of sitting down and working with them through some actual problems for them to start really realizing how things work. I think at some point I also realized a key point is debugging. It is like understanding how at runtime they can understand what the data is, where it is, where it came from, or why they don't have the data more often. So yeah, I think it's still the case, and I think it will always to some degree remain the case that Relay is not the most natural framework for people to onboard to when they are used to a vanilla-ish JavaScript environment. And I don't think there is necessarily, look, I think there's probably a lot that we can do as a community just to improve that. But I think there is going to be some point where we need to just accept that that's the case. I think it is fine for Relay to be a certain type of framework and not all of the things, where other target frameworks can target other areas.
Right, it's like an extra layer of abstraction, right? Like, hopefully it like pays off to learn, but like it's certainly more complicated than a fetch, right? Like, if you just call a vanilla fetch call and like it fetches the data for your to-do app, like that's probably easier, right?
Yeah. I mean, if somebody tells me I'm going to write this one marketing page and I need to fetch some data, I'm not going to tell them, oh, you should look into Relay. They probably should just maybe get that thing done, because it's also not something that's going to live a long time. They might work on it on their own, right? So there's multiple axes of scale. There's there's number of engineers. There's the amount of time you need to maintain it. So I think once you have those things, Relay is that you're going to pay some cost, but it will pay off in the long term. And so then it becomes much more natural to choose between. It's not just arbitrary choices, like it sometimes seems like. Well, these are all GraphQL clients. Like, they are not necessarily equal, right? And so you make that. It took a little while before I realized the cost, but then in the end, and we definitely had a lot of debates about it. Should we keep going with this or not? Also because of other, which I'm sure that we'll get into, other reasons, like the flexibility or inflexibility of Relay at times, and our setup. So we had those debates, but in the end we sticked with it, and definitely that has paid off, and it still does, as far as I know.
Nice. We have a question from the chat. Arnar is asking, Eloy, if you also took part in designing the GraphQL schema at Artsy, and if you did the schema first.
Well, so when we started looking at it, the web team had already started adopting GraphQL. And like I said, there was no other JavaScript client. So they were doing a fetch and then distributing the data through the React tree. Or not even, no, React tree. Yeah, there was some React experimentation, but most of it was, I'm gonna say it wrong, so I don't even know, like semi-half-grown, homegrown framework and some existing Express templating systems, I guess. So we did not initially design the schema, which led to some of the issues that we had to deal with Relay for years and years to come. One of them was that each type had an ID field, and many of the types were just basically pass-throughs of the database representation. So there was not much GraphQL design thought around types. It was exposing the database types as they existed through GraphQL, and then linking them so that you could make one request, right? So the database ID was not a globally unique ID, which Relay expects definitely in the classic days and the initial modern. Well, I guess nowadays you can if you really try, but it's not something that is exposed as please use this. So we had a fork of Relay that we used in production for years and years, and different attempts at PRs to make that possible. I see Jan.
I remember. Yeah, I remember.
Yeah. We've had, I think over the years, we've had multiple occasions where we would be in the same town, meet up, and then talk about these things. And this is the scale at which is a different topic, which I think we also get at the scale at which open source contribution with Relay works. It's like its relative time goes different, which I think is a great thing. But yeah, so the schema initially, no. We did at some point decide we need a version 2 of the schema to clean up a lot of the things that we just didn't know at the time, and made some decisions that in retrospect we wanted to do differently, which was a very interesting endeavor. We did a lot of code mods, both on the server and in the client. But I guess with to the question schema first, I guess that's whether or not a schema is defined in SDL, right?
I guess so, yeah. That's the way I interpret it as well, yeah.
Yeah, no, so we didn't do that. I think at the time, even GraphQL.js didn't allow you to, like SDL conceptually always existed, of course, but actually defining a schema, I don't know that it allowed you to do that from the start.
I don't think so either, no.
Yeah, so it has always been based on the underlying GraphQL.js objects. And I think that is, for us, in the end, it was better. It allows you, many things have been written about this. Recently, I had to look it up for somebody. I think there was a Prisma article that summarized it well. I think that the issue that we would have had to deal with was that SDL can get verbose, right? So if you use the objects, you have the ability to use the language to do some meta stuff or generate types. Whereas if you use SDL, well, you end up, I guess, concatenating strings. It's just not the same type of experience. And programmatically, we were able to do a few more things that were interesting, especially during the phase that we went to V2, which would have been a little harder, maybe not impossible, but with SDL. But it just didn't exist at the time. So
yeah, I'd like to, since we're on the topic, I'd like to talk a bit about your open source contributions to Relay, and also like the experience around that. So could you, I guess, do your resume on contributions to Relay open source.
What? Sorry, what
Because
was what was the
like
subject?
you've been involved in quite a few contributions to Relay itself, right? In open source side. So like, what contributions have you been involved with? I know one that I'm very thankful for, and also very interested in. But if you could just talk a bit about how that's been for you, and also again on the process around which you mentioned here. But yeah, how the experience has been around that.
Well, like what my actual contributions are is putting me a little on the spot because my memory is just literally like 2 weeks-ish.
Let's focus on the language plugin then.
Yeah, so there's definitely that one, right? So like I said initially, Flow was not going to be our choice. We wanted TypeScript. And I think initially I did some work to just take the Flow. I don't know if we took the Flow types and converted those to TypeScript, or we did it basically the same as what the plugin does, very rudimentary based on the schema. But it was definitely clear that what we needed was to be on par with the Flow type emission. And as we will get to with how, from my perspective, the open source process works with Relay, it was good to not have that exist in the repo itself. So for there to be some form of plugin system, which is always hard, right? As soon as you drop the word plugin, it's like, oh, now we need a committee to define the boundaries and right. So it was more of just like a way of like, well, this is how the Flow code works, and we'll define a Flow interface that will be kept up to date just because that's how it works. And then if you can get it to work, then that's great. And that's what we did that, right? So my contribution there was just to take what existed and to identify the pieces that one would need to make another language plugin, such as the TypeScript one, and which just meant refactoring some pieces of Relay to put them in the right place for that to be a possibility. I would say my work there, as much work is in open source, was just more working with the people rather than a lot of implementation work. I guess a lot of implementation work went into the TypeScript plugin, but the contribution into having the possibility to have these language plugins in Relay itself was probably more working with the Relay team to understand what was okay, what their assumptions would be, and have like an equally understood and agreed upon boundary, which worked, right? I think it has worked wonders. I think a lot of people I speak to that use Relay use it with TypeScript, and so I think that's probably. And the TypeScript plugin itself, it does a lot of work, but it doesn't do much novel stuff. It's all pretty much based on what the Relay team has provided. So I think it's a testament to the Relay team for building something that works really well for them, and then allowing us to adapt it where needed to some extent for other situations. Which I would love to get into. I don't know if I see Jan, he wants to.
Yeah, I was thinking it'd be interesting to like add my side, the Facebook side to the contributions. I'm not really like long on time, but maybe that's interesting enough to talk about. At Facebook was open source tools. We generally for Facebook, the open source Facebook brings out is like we first and foremost like build something that works for Facebook. So it's like incredibly important to be like as fast as it can be, scaling to many developers, be efficient, right? Like our code base is just like insanely huge. So I don't think I can name the numbers, but like there's like many thousands of components, right? And compiling them, for example, we can, we have big problems with like how fast this goes. So like there's concerns about like not adding too much overhead and like, for example, in plugin system, right? Like had to be done in a way that it doesn't really add significant overhead. But yeah, we want to make things that work for Facebook, because we think, if we can make them work for Facebook, they probably also might provide value to other people.
Yeah.
And I think there also comes a lot of like benefits with it, right? Like our code base is so large, we cannot really afford many breaking changes, right? Like I think that's something you see with React, but also with Relay, right? Like we have so many components that we cannot really break APIs. That like adds a lot of constraints to thinking of like how you introduce changes, right?
I think even there was like, even at some point I suggested a change that would improve the developer experience, but it meant you would have to bust the cache. And I was like, the build cache is just at Facebook. It's gonna take like one person 5 minutes to recompile everything, multiplied by the times of engineers. It's just gonna be.
Yeah. So I think those are like interesting constraints, but yeah, I guess we like briefly mentioned that in the beginning, that we have the Rust compiler. We didn't really talk about that, but basically we like really tried everything with JavaScript to make it fast enough for our big code base, and like single-threaded limitations of JavaScript just weren't enough for us anymore.
Yeah.
Wasn't like rapid growth that brought the new Facebook homepage like project had like added very quickly, like every day, like a lot of components were added that needed to be compiled continuously. So we really needed to make it like so much faster, and I think part of that, what we realized is that we really want to like bring the TypeScript thing as a first party feature in the future. So it's like barely usable in open source right now, but I think you can already run a Rust compiler, and there's like a bunch of options missing there. The configuration is probably not great, so it's like in an early stage for open source, but internally it has already replaced all of the JavaScript compiler with like fairly recently actually, but so it was a massive, very long project trying to get this like to exact output parity with like all of the subtle bugs and weird things that the JavaScript output had. But yeah, hopefully we can bring more of the TypeScript things as first party features. This is like a little bit of a longer process because it's kind of hard to prioritize working on TypeScript when we already worked so much on the compiler and there's like other interesting new things you would want to work on. But yeah, hopefully that makes progress. I think there's a bunch of open source issues on the Relay repo that are potential like new contributions to make this happen. Make the Rust compiler happen. There's like questions how that works, but make it fully a great experience in open source before we switch out the JavaScript version. But
right. And there's because you've gone through and kind of you've labeled a few issues I know about places where you'd be happy to get contributions from open source. So for anyone interested in who knows a lot of Rust, it'd be cool to go in there and have a look.
Yep. I would like to touch a little bit on like the usage perspective of like, so how Facebook puts out a open source piece of software like Relay, something that, aside from the usage, like hurdles, like the compiler or whatnot, onboarding people. Another thing people often ask me about is, I guess the inflexibility of Relay to adapt to their more, no, not even more exotic, just different setup, and also the seeming the pace at which contributions are accepted to Relay to adapt to those, which by which obviously we mean it goes very slow. And and I think we should all just recognize that for what it is, and which I think is for a good reason, right? So I think, like Jan is saying, Relay is made to solve Facebook's problem, right? It does that well. It doesn't strive to be a kitchen sink. While Facebook does many things, and if it works for Facebook, it probably works for others. Of course, it doesn't strive to solve every problem out of the box, and nor do they want it to be that, because it would probably suffer from some from some overhead, right? One thing I will say is, like, in all those years, never have I had to deal with a single runtime bug caused by Relay. And so the cost of not having engineers dedicated to just like the open source side of things to be able to review them well and test them throughout their applications and whatnot means that you cannot just accept any change, right? Like, even the seemingly simplest patch might trigger on unintended consequences. And so while my Relay PRs some of my Relay PRs definitely have like the longest shelf life, I appreciate, like, I don't see that necessarily as a bad thing, right? Like, the back and forth goes slowly, but it's, there is always, there's thought being put into it, and I appreciate that. It also means that other people that have like wild ideas, their changes also won't suddenly affect my well-running application, right? It's just not gonna change suddenly in weird ways from one day to the other. It's not like, oh, the third Relay upgrade this week, right? It's just that doesn't happen. So I appreciate it for what, like I said initially, like, if you would take on that dependency, then it's part of your application. And Relay really, I think, so mostly when I run into an issue, it would probably be at the compile phase, which is fine because, that's compilation. At runtime, not a single runtime bug, and that's definitely, that's great work. And that means that any of the changes that go in have been well vetted, and that's worth something. So I think that's what I was saying with time is relatively different with Relay. It just
I wanted to add, like, basically the PRs that take a long time to review are the ones that like change something in the runtime, or the compiler where we had like the JavaScript compiler had a lot of internal extensions, so like that was kind of hard to review at times. But there's also like PRs that are very easy to quickly merge, and we obviously don't have long round trip times. They're like documentation fixes are like typically like fairly easy to review and merge, right? That's just something I wanted to briefly add.
Yeah, I think that's. I agree with the stability over the years of Relay. It's pretty interesting that there are. I don't think I've experienced, especially not around the store and the cache. I haven't experienced. I don't think I've experienced any bug either throughout the years. And I'd rather have it slow and bug free than fast and broken. I guess, yeah.
I just remembered another thing that basically over the years working on the framework, I really learned to like, my instinct is to say no. Like, anyone wants to like add something and it's like, can we expose like this type at runtime, or can we expose like these things at runtime? It's like, my first instinct is no, because we sometimes said yes after a little bit back and forth, like also to internal requests, right? Like internally, some product teams like, if we can just expose this, it would make our life like so much easier. And then like after a bunch of back and forth, maybe I said yes and we merged something, and then years down the road, it's like still biting us that like, I wish we didn't expose this, but there's so much like product code and relying on exposing some API, and that we like, that now is like really like limiting what we can do. So they're just like, my first instinct is always like, no, can we like, do you have a workaround? And then say like, yes, but it's kind of a pain. It's like, okay, that's good enough, you know?
Yeah.
Probably. I really want to like convince myself deeply that it's a good idea to add, because when we add, like basically an API is a append only, right? Like you can only add to an API once you have something in the API, and there's probably after a while, there's like so many uses of it that it's a massive effort to like remove something.
Yeah.
So that's often also just instinct reject, or you know, like
Yeah. So which I I have come to really appreciate. And so the longest living one thing was like this alternative ID that we didn't have, which existed for years. The PR, we tried different ways, and it didn't end up happening. I think in the end, it was better for us anyways to have migrated the schema and just adhere to the specification.
Yeah, I mean, you know, just think of like React. I bet there's like so many requests in the React repro of like exposing some API or adding something, and imagine they said yes to like most of them, right? Like the React API would be like insanely complex and large, but and the React runtime would also just get slower and larger over time.
So we've ran over time a bit here, but this was such an interesting topic, and I think this is also very important because, like looking at the pull requests, it's easy to see that stuff do take time, but I think this is very valuable to hear from you as well, John, like how you are approaching these things, and that makes it easier to wait. So we'll need to wrap up this section now, so we have time for some mutations as well. But thank you very much, Eloy, and John as well. This has been very interesting, and I'm going to post all the links we've been talking about in the chat here during the break. And go check out the Artsy apps, the open source Artsy apps. It's like this. That's for real. So it's a real app that's open sourced. It's very nice to see how you solve different things, and how you can even look at how it's evolved over time. Any parting, or not parting, but any finishing words from Eloy? Or
well, no, again, Gabriel, thank you for starting this. A long time ago, a few of us had aspirations to start somewhat of a community around Relay, which I definitely think has made it easier for people after us to onboard. And I'm really grateful to see this moving on and becoming more public facing rather than some channels here and there, right? So thank you so much. And of course, thank you to Jan and the team for the excellent work. And I'm just so sorry that you all moved to New York, where actually all the Relay action was happening. Like, it was interesting that there's multiple art related companies in New York using Relay. And then when they decided to move to New York, I left.
Oh, well.
Yeah, I can only second Eloy in there. Thanks for like starting this. Thanks for inviting us. Our agenda like slightly changed, and we talked about random other things, but I think it was super interesting to kind of go back of the history and motivations.
Yeah, thank you both for coming. I mean, this has also been something I've been thinking about for a long time, and my thing has always been, I've really enjoyed being in the Relay community, even though it's very small, because it's full of people who are very both good at what they do, but also innovative, and there's a lot happening. It's just not very public. That's the thing. Like, and it's I usually say that with Relay as well. It's really such a hidden gem, I guess. Like, it's a feature complete, rock solid framework that's used in production at very large places and scales, but people don't know about it. So and that's where we, the community, can help out, both with these types of things, but also around documentation and trying to land PRs that make it easier for the open source users. So I'm hoping that this can be a start of a trend there as well. So let's take a few minutes, just a little break. and we'll get back and talk about mutations. So yeah, a couple of minutes, I guess. Take the time you need. So see you soon. So let's wait another minute or so before we get ready. Okay. John and Hila, are you?
Yep, I'm back here.
You're back here? Nice. Okay, so let's jump into the next part then. So this part is going to be about updating the cache after mutations, and again, very unscientifically, but this is an area where at least I encounter most of the struggling with Relay, and it's not necessarily about how Relay works. It's more about that updating a local cache is kind of tricky, especially in something like GraphQL where you have so many interdependencies and things affect each other, and yeah. But we're going to try and dig down deep into how this works at Facebook, and Artsy, as Eloy mentioned, doesn't have too much mutations, but we'll talk about Artsy as well, like how if you have, how you've been treating them throughout the years. But before we do any of that, I'd just like to start with just recapping updating the cache and mutations and kind of what the problem is. And both Eloy and John, please feel free to jump in and correct me whenever I'm offbeat. But so the problem is that when you're updating data, you could potentially affect just about anything in your data graph. So a bunch of data might become stale after you've run the mutation. In a lot of cases, that's not going to be the case. So in a lot of cases, you're just updating one property. But in a lot of cases, it's the other way around. You're updating one property and it affects, well, not everything, but a lot of things. So the strategies that you typically take in order to fix this is to have the server send back all of the data that's been updated, if you can do that. And thanks to really having a normalized cache and you hopefully having globally unique IDs, really will know how to update things that come back all by itself. But that doesn't work for all scenarios. You also have the option to update the cache locally yourself. So imperatively going into the cache and doing just about anything you can think of in the cache. And then you also have the classic solution, which is refetching things that might have changed, kind of. Or you could do all of the above, like in some combination, which is usually how things end up being. And what Relay offers to deal with this is, like I mentioned, there's if you're updating an object which has a globally unique ID, Relay will know how to update your UI automatically. So for instance, if you're updating the avatar of a user and you're requesting that updated avatar URL back from your mutation, Relay is going to be able to update all components that render that avatar URL automatically without you having to do anything. Then there's also, like I said, manual imperative cache updaters, which means that after mutation, you can go into the cache and do just about anything that you need yourself. And then there's a thing called mutation updater configs. And I would like to ask John about this because my impression is that they aren't used as much anymore, or that you're not advocating using them, right?
Yeah, that's right. And they're basically a leftover from Relay Classic.
Right.
Relay Classic had a different approach to mutations. There was a lot more automatic, where Relay tried to keep track of like how any field in the store could be refetched and automatically fetch whatever you define a mutation could possibly update this work most of the time. If it didn't work, it was surprising and confusing how to debug and figure out what broke the magic. And very importantly, it was also extremely expensive. And there was like a lot of overhead. The modern store basically only contains the GraphQL data, right? There's not much overhead to it. The Relay Classic contained all of these like information of how a field was fetched and how to get to this field from a query and how to construct these queries at runtime dynamically. And we found that was just like a huge amount of time spent on dynamically constructing these queries to send. So the mutation updater configs were kind of like part of our migration strategy that reflect most of the Relay Classic APIs to be able to translate those into Relay Modern. And we had this Relay compatibility layer in between. It's a whole story, and that's like luckily behind us, but that allowed us to migrate a whole lot of components over time and get rid of the Relay Classic. But yeah, I think generally the other approaches of optimistic responses and the imperative store update APIs, they should probably cover in those cases in a more elegant way.
Right. And for those who don't know what the mutation updater configs are, it's basically a way to, by describing what you want to change in, in a config.
You would describe like the create comment mutation would append a comment to this connection that you can find here in this under this ID. The recently merged declarative connection mutations, I forgot whose PR this was, unfortunately, but they're pretty great. It was you.
What did you say?
They're really great because they basically express the same ideas, just feels a lot more natural to relay. And yeah, I think they probably are a lot better way to deal with this going forward.
Yeah, well, it's the last bullet point here, so we'll jump to that right then. But yeah, it's for those who don't know. I don't think anything of it is documented properly yet, but it's a way of using GraphQL directives in your mutation in order to relay what you want to happen with the, either like if you're deleting something that you want to also delete a node in the store or adding something to a connection or removing something from a connection. I
think what's interesting is like, why do we even need this, right? I think that's maybe something interesting to talk about before is like, why are mutations so complicated, right? And there's the easy case is rename an issue, right? Rename, and there's a rename issue mutation, and the response is in the issue, and you just fetch the new name, and the ID automatically, and it knows this issue ID has a new name property. Unfortunately, it's not as easy always, right? What if you have an alphabetically sorted list of all the issues? Now, does that reorder? If you rename an issue, and then potentially this list could be updated. It's a question if you want to update it directly, but there is just applications that can have this like infinite amount of side effects. Facebook one of the craziest examples is blocking a user. It sounds pretty trivial, but if you block someone, they basically disappear from your perspective, right? There any friends list, any lists of commenters, any in your feed, they're removed. There shouldn't appear anywhere anymore, and that's really like such a simple simple sounding case that has just these ripple effects over everything. And there's everything between, right? Obviously there's like simple like change of value mutations. They're like a lot easier. Connections are interesting because connections always kind of have a client component to them, where a connection can basically be almost infinite, right? And it's any list that could have like tens of thousands of items in them. Your Twitter feed, right, is like, you obviously, if you like create a tweet, you don't want to refetch your whole history of tweets that you ever tweeted, right? So we need to prepend the new tweet to the list of your existing tweets, and that's where the imperative APIs come into play, or the directives.
Yeah. So that's one thing that you mentioned that I would really like to hear how you're dealing with is, yeah, like you said, if you have a list that's alphabetically sorted and then you update the name of an item in the list, do you typically refetch the list, or do you typically sort it on the client to account for that, or how do you have a way of typically approaching those types of things? Or
I think there's a lot of design questions. They're not just technical questions, but like even user perspective questions, right? If you have this alphabetically, take the GitHub issues, right, and assume they're alphabetically sorted. If you rename something, and you only view in the first page, and it's like all A, and you rename it to X, right? Does it like disappear from your perspective? Or you only view open issues and you close one, right? Does it like instantly disappear? Or do you maybe want to, like, even if it's the list of open issues, something you just client mutated to close, maybe it should stay there, right? It's basically a lot of like product questions first and product design questions. What do you actually want to happen? And kind of from there, you kind of need to get creative. Unfortunately, there's no like magic solutions to these
darn.
You can also imagine that maybe you have a bunch of different saved searches, right? And you don't know, like, if you change something about an item, does it like appear or disappear from certain saved searches? It's like maybe only the server really knows, right? I think that's would be a good case for what we didn't talk about, the invalidation APIs, right? Where you just say, if I change an item, I just need to re-invalidate all of the saved searches. And then next time I'm trying to fetch them, they're just gonna not hit the cache. They just need to refetch and go to the server, because there's no realistic way for us to evaluate some complex search criteria on the client. Or maybe we don't want to do that.
Yeah, that's interesting. So because the invalidation APIs, just for those who haven't seen them before, it's a way of marking items or nodes, I guess you want to call them, or records even, in the store as invalid or stale, I guess is maybe the right word. And this is a fairly new addition, right? It's not that old. And is it working in the experimental APIs only, or is it also working in the?
I actually don't know that. So one thing about working on the framework for such a long time is sometimes if I don't work on a certain part of the framework, I kind of it's paged out of my working memory. But it's just an API on the base of the store, so it should really work with independent of what your React API is.
Right. So what you do is, say, let's take the blocked user example. So if you do a mutation to block a user, you would, in your updater for that mutation, you'd go in, you'd find that the node corresponding to that user, and then you'd tell Relay that this is now stale or this is invalid. And when any query that is rendering that user through any fragment, or the next time the query is evaluated, it would remake its request, right? Or refetch its data automatically. It would be as if it doesn't exist, I guess.
Yeah, there's two different ways of invalidation. There's the per item invalidation, and then there's a way you mark a specific ID as stale. Mm-hmm. And then there's also a nuclear option of just marking everything as stale.
The red button.
And the effect that has is if we want to load a new query and we check if the query is fulfilled from the store, so we don't need to go to the server, then that API will just say this is no longer available in the store as fresh data. And we go fetch from the server. Now, marking something as invalid or stale doesn't instantly refetch all of the data that's displayed anywhere on your page. One example would be you scroll down on your feed a long time and you have 100 items on there. Do you really want to make the refetch the 100 items? Maybe they're not even in the same order anymore, because some ranking was updated or something. So maybe there's not even a way to fetch all of the results again and update everything. So yeah, it really only affects the next navigation. One place where we've seen that happen a lot is if you're on a certain page and you want to send a mutation for an item, you might know all of the things that are affected on that page, and you can write an imperative updater or have the mutation fetch all of the fields you care about for that page, but you don't know what other pages there are that display the same object and what fields that might be affected by your mutation.
Right. So a long shot here, but something that I've been thinking about and experiencing, because you're primarily focused on web now, I guess, with the new experimental APIs. So have you discussed anything or thought anything about invalidation in the context of React Native, where you usually have a stack of screens that keep being present kind of when you go back to them, rather than fully re-rendering as you do on web, kind of, if you understand my question? So
yeah. We still have big project also going on the React Native side on Facebook. The marketplace app on the native app is all React Native. I'm not sure what other parts are public documented in the React Native, but I think marketplace is definitely mentioned as being all React Native, and it's super visible app. And I think basically the similar principles apply in there. I think what's interesting about React Native and generally mobile apps is then there's less data on the screen, right? You typically on a mobile app, there's not much screen real estate. So you typically have like one list, or you display the details of one item. So there, on a desktop app, there can be like notifications on the right side. You have some main view, a menu, and then another thing popping out, and just many different widgets on the page that potentially might display the same items. The same user might like appear in like many different places, and maybe so in that way, native React Native and web are different, but I'm not quite sure about stacked views. I think there you can do something similar where you invalidate and check on a navigation pop on a back navigation, check if the views are still valid, and maybe force fetch them.
Right. So is Marketplace, is it also in using Relay, or?
Yeah, it's also React Native is basically always at Facebook means React Native plus Relay.
Oh, okay, cool. And I guess can you say anything? Have you like rolled out the experimental APIs in React Native as well there, or maybe that's not public yet? I guess because of concurrent mode and suspense on React Native and whatnot.
I don't Fabric is the code name for the project that's bringing bringing suspense to React Native. I hope I'm not messing things up here. But yeah, it's not fully ready. I think what we use internally is pretty in sync with what's in open source in terms of React Native.
Right. So Eloy, like at Artsy, the various mutations that you do have, how is the experience? Is there anything to like mention about your experience around updating the cache throughout the years? Because I'm like I said before, my experience is that this is usually where people get stuck for a while. Kind of, they end up with some form of complex thing they need to do with updating the cache, and then it's a bit harder than other things. Like, do you have anything from what you're
Well, I can definitely attest that doing mutations, even a few, leads to some struggles. Because obviously you go from trying to think declaratively about everything to imperative. And you are, in some cases, you've become trained to be thinking about data masking, and then suddenly a mutation is like, no, actually now you need to know all the things that the application might do. And so even besides that being counterintuitive, it's just hard, right? Because you can't really expect, even if you get it entirely right at the time that you write the mutation, somebody else at some point is going to add some data on one of the other screens, and they're not going to think about updating your mutation. So
if I can just super briefly add to that, like, yeah, it's totally breaking like your encapsulation and what was I talking earlier about of like thinking locally, it, like totally breaks that. And I think you're like spot on there. One kind of trick that's possible to use there is to just reuse if you have an update art mutation, then you could include the fragment, the like display art fragment in your mutation, and so your mutation basically says, I want to refetch all the fields that my display art fragment specifies. So you don't need to explicitly write out everything. You can like actually use fragments as part of your mutation, and that basically pulls in the dependencies of the parts of that need to be refetched without duplicating them.
Yeah, and I think in the end, in most cases, maybe even all at Artsy, that was fine in the end. Usually I think so when it comes to um, um, having everything, like for me, I really enjoy one file that is longer, taller than my screen, and it has exactly all the things that I think of when I think of that piece of UI. But that's also not one of the things that comes naturally to a lot of uh, existing vanilla JavaScript React developers, right? There's like the tendency to move everything into different files. And so, which then often also led to them using like the relay mask false directive, or just to get around like not understanding how to otherwise debug things. And so I don't recall the details, but I think this was the one legit case where we agreed you were allowed to use unmasking because you were pulling in a fragment perhaps from somewhere else, and it was just at least let's have a fragment in a single place, and then violate somewhat of the patterns that we otherwise want to eschew. But so yeah, so it's definitely, especially when you don't do it. I guess if people were to do it day in day out, then maybe it would be a little more natural. But I think in our cases, every time we had to write mutations, it was definitely like, okay, let's do this exercise again, figure this out. And then there's the case, of course, of the store APIs, the types, like interacting with the types not being typed. Right, which has definitely always been a good way to guide engineers through how to use the APIs and the associated data. So it's just a whole lot of it's a murky area.
It's an interesting thing with because Relay is so good at like generating correct types and everything, and then you come to the updaters and it's all Wild West kind of to do whatever you please.
There's been like a long ongoing question of like, what could we do there? And we really haven't like come up with anything great as an idea even. Our schema is certainly too large to generate the full flow type for everything that, every type and every object that you might have. And we had this like idea of maybe defining like a fragment, and then that you could somehow, that we could create a correct flow type or TypeScript type for the fragment that is then used as an update function somehow. But that's an open question of like how we could type something as like flexible as the store update API.
I did an experiment a while back, or a few years back, where I generated flow types for the entire store based on your schema, just for like typing the updaters. And while it did work out for my teeny schema, I think I had pets, and then I had owners of pets, and then I had a few connections here and there, and it ended up like breaking VS Code for me, the amount of types that was generated. And I can imagine that, yes, you don't have to have a very large schema for that codegen to be totally infeasible, kind of.
Now that we're talking about it, we don't really need to generate types for the entire schema, right? Just any of the types and fields that are actually being used, which Relay already kind of knows about, but which still is probably an insane amount. Maybe even all of your schema if the application drives the schema. But so no, definitely, so that's that case. I guess, but also, like I said, at Artsy we had less mutations, and in some cases we just don't really, there are things like an artist follow count changing. We're not going to invalidate that, even if there's like already an artist view somewhere in the stack. There's nobody that's going to be like, 1 star on the App Store because I just happen to know that it cannot have been 42,000 followers because I followed it elsewhere, right? It's just like irrelevant. So and also because so with an application, with a with a native application, I think, well, I guess with a single page web application, you a long living application and having like a cache actually in the browser, you can have these issues as well. But the thing what we didn't want to do is just serialize the store and just treat it as a long living thing, because that's like we would end up with the possibility of just replicating all of Artsy's data, which is just not feasible. So we would do network response level caching with some invalidation, and that also made it very trivial for us to do some other native optimizations, such as fetching, making a request for the initial view while React Native is still booting. Because
about that, because that since Artsy is all open source, that's also available in open source, right? The way you're doing kicking off queries before. That's very interesting. That's the thing you
It's inspired entirely by Facebook. At least I think it was inspired by them. I might have just dreamt it, but that's this obviously with React Native you pay some overhead costs as well, and so if you are able to if you have statically compiled already all the queries and you know ahead of time what it is that you need to fetch, then you can move that into the native side while React Native is booting. And so, yeah, we did that. And then there was also, because the Artsy app was a brownfield app, there was some pieces of the app that might need that data as well. So we have that native integration. But as far as caching goes, we tried to just keep it very trivial, just response caching, and that was fine.
Yeah.
And we would just wipe them all if a mutation happened.
Yeah, that's also talking about the red nuclear button. That's also a well-suited case for that. So just connecting back to the store updater directives. So I think like one benefit of them, and also of the idea of the imperative or the mutation updater configs that used to exist, is that if possible, you'd want to be able to cover most of the mundane tasks with things that don't make you need to go into the imperative side of the store, kind of. And I think that the store updater directives are covering a lot of ground there, and hopefully they'll help. And because I guess like it's great that it's there and you can do just about anything with the imperative APIs, but if you can avoid it, your life is probably going to be easier. One thing that I've noticed is especially around more complex optimistic mutations, where things can get quite complex quite quickly, where you need to create like local records before you've actually added something on the server and tying things together. So hopefully the store directives can help with that as well. But it's an interesting aspect. It's nice to hear that, John, that you are well, actively, but semi-actively thinking about the typing of the updating, because that is something that's occupied my mind as well for quite a long time. It's an interesting problem. I mean, it's a very interesting thing, just because you need the flexibility of being able to do just about anything inside of the updaters, because that's the only time you reach for them. So yeah.
But yeah, I think trying to like just cover more cases where you don't need the like low-level API is probably like the more promising direction. And I think until now, like basically the connection, append to connection, pre-append to connection was probably the most common case for needing a custom updater, imperative updater API. Most other things can probably just be done by querying the server for the new value.
Right. So we're out of time. This feels like we could discuss all of these subjects the entire night, but that's going to be, well, night for me then. It's almost night here. But so just I was eventually gonna get to this slide, which I guess we've already covered. So so we'll skip that one. But and here are some resources for information around mutations. And I would like to especially plug the a guided tour of relay parts of the experimental documentation, which is really, really good and ties things together in a very nice way and kind of explains to you step by step what Relay is doing, why it's doing it, and how you can fix all of the different things that you might need fixing in your app. And it covers, obviously, it covers invalidating data and updating the cache and things around that. It's really good. And it's hidden, as usual with Relay. It's hidden far down in the experimental documentation. So hopefully it can surface as soon as the experimental APIs are marked as stable. I will post all of these links as well. And again, John and Eloy, thank you so much for coming on. I've learned a ton myself, and it's been really nice to discuss all these things with you both. And I hope we can continue doing this. Well, maybe not us three every time, but still, like continue this trend of having this thing. I think it's very valuable for the community, and it's so nice to hear you talk about real life experiences, both from Artsy, which has been something that you, at least I've always had in mind and looked at in terms of Relay, kind of how Artsy is using Relay and the contributions that Artsy has made to Relay, and you as well, Eloy. And also hearing from the core team is always interesting because you're always doing interesting stuff. So very happy to have you both on, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Gabriel. Thank you, Jan.
Thanks again. I also joined the Meetup, the Discord channel, but also like different other things to catch up to. I hope I have some time to like check in there.
Yeah. Well, if you do, it'd be cool to have you. So for those of you who are interested, there's a Discord link here. And just join the Discord, and we'll try and get some voice chatting going or regular chatting if people are more up for that. I've tried to divide up a few rooms already. We'll see if I need to revise that, but we'll see if people are interested in talking. So again, thank you very much for joining, and I will make sure to announce as soon as I can the next meetup. I'm hoping to do at least one more this year, before the end of this year. And I have a hopefully fairly interesting topic that I would love to cover. So I'm going to try and see if I can make that work. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And goodbye. I'll leave this screen up for a while now so people can see the Discord link. And then I'll go and join the Discord myself. Okay, John, Eloy, thank you.
See you next year at the Relay Conf in Stockholm.
Yes, yeah, I have a big garden. We can have it outside.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Have a good one.
Yeah, see ya.
Ciao.